The judge leaned forward, staring at the defendant with visible impatience. "You're asking this court to review evidence from 20 years ago," he said. "Do you understand how absurd that sounds?" The defendant nodded calmly. "Yes, Your Honor, because 20 years ago." The truth was recorded. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's voice hardened. Security cameras from that time barely functioned. Why would you believe anything still exists? Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to Sweet Justice, because what this man asked the judge to do next changed the meaning of justice forever. Asterisk, the defendant raised his eyes, steady and unafraid. "Because, Your Honor," he said quietly, "someone made sure it was never erased." The judge paused. "For 20 years, the man continued, I've lived with a conviction I didn't earn, waiting for one moment like this." The courtroom fell silent as the judge slowly leaned back in his chair. "Call the court technician," he said. And in that moment, no one realized they were about to reopen a case the system had tried very hard to bury. Asterisk, the courtroom technician hesitated before approaching the judge's bench. His fingers hovered above the keyboard like he was touching something fragile, something not meant to be disturbed. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "records from 20 years ago were archived manually. Most of the footage was overwritten or destroyed during the system upgrade." The defendant stood still, hands folded, eyes fixed not on the screen, but on the judge. Judge Holloway studied him for a long moment. There was no panic in the man's face, no desperation, only patience, the kind that comes from waiting a very long time. "Proceed anyway," the judge said. The technician nodded and typed in a case reference number the defendant had provided from memory. A low hum filled the courtroom as an ancient hard drive spun to life. Lines of text flashed across the screen, dates, timestamps, file names that looked more like forgotten artifacts than evidence. The prosecutor leaned toward the judge. "Your Honor, with respect, this is a dangerous precedent. Reopening obsolete footage." "Be quiet," the judge said. Without raising his voice, the gallery leaned forward as the screen flickered. Static, gray noise. Then, slowly, an image stabilized. It was grainy, black and white. A courthouse hallway, dimly lit. The timestamp read May 14, 2005, 11:42 p.m. The defendant exhaled for the first time since the session began. "That's it," he said softly. "Please, play it." The footage showed a younger version of the courthouse, narrower hallways, older signage. A man walked into frame wearing a maintenance jacket. He paused near an evidence locker, glanced over his shoulder, then unlocked it. The prosecutor frowned. "That's not my client." The defendant didn't respond. Moments later, another man entered the frame. Taller, wearing a suit. His face partially obscured by the poor resolution, but his posture unmistakably confident. He spoke to the maintenance worker, gesturing sharply. The worker nodded nervously and stepped aside. The suited man opened the locker, removed a sealed evidence bag, and replaced it with another. The courtroom erupted. Asterisk, that's tampering. Someone shouted from the gallery. The judge struck the gavel. "Order." The prosecutor stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this footage is inconclusive. Faces are unclear. This could be anyone." The defendant finally spoke again. "That man," he said, voice steady, "is the lead investigator who testified against me. The same man who swore, under oath, that the evidence was untouched." The judge's jaw tightened. "State your name." "For the record." The man straightened. "Daniel Mercer." A ripple of recognition moved through the room. 20 years earlier, Daniel Mercer had been convicted of armed robbery and conspiracy. He was 26 years old then, a delivery driver. No prior record, sentenced to 25 years. Judge Holloway leaned back slowly. "Mr. Mercer, why now?" Asterisk, Daniel's eyes never left the screen. "Because I was told this footage didn't exist because every appeal I filed was denied. Because I served 20 years for a crime I didn't commit." He paused, and because today was the first time someone finally listened. The prosecutor's voice sharpened. "Even if this footage is real, it doesn't exonerate you. It shows evidence handling irregularities, not innocence." Daniel turned toward him. "Then play the rest." The technician hesitated. "Sir, the remaining footage is from inside the interrogation room." The judge's hand froze mid-air. "Play," he said. The screen changed. A younger Daniel sat at a metal table, wrists cuffed, blood visible at his hairline. Two officers stood over him. One slammed a folder down. "Confess," the officer said. His voice distorted but audible. Daniel in the video shook. His head weakly. Then came the sound. A strike. The gallery gasped as the footage showed the officer grabbing Daniel by the collar, shoving him back into the chair. "You'll sign," the officer said, "or you'll never see daylight again." In the courtroom, Daniel closed his eyes. The judge stood. "That's enough," Holloway said, his voice tight. The prosecutor stammered. "Your Honor, this footage." "Sit down," the judge snapped. Now, the courtroom was dead. Silent. Judge Holloway turned to Daniel. "Why didn't anyone see this before?" Daniel opened his eyes. They were wet, but his voice didn't break. "Because the camera was officially malfunctioning that night. That's what the report said. But someone forgot one thing." He swallowed. They forgot that the backup system ran on a separate power supply. The judge slowly lowered himself back into his chair. "You memorized the timestamp," he said. Daniel nodded. "I replayed it in my head every night. I knew if the footage existed anywhere, it would be there." The prosecutor rose again, desperation creeping into his tone. "Your Honor, even if procedural misconduct occurred, this court cannot." The judge raised a hand. "For 20 years, Holloway said quietly, this court relied on sworn testimony. And for 20 years, that testimony appears to have been a lie." He looked at Daniel again. "What happened after the interrogation?" Daniel took a breath. "They offered me a deal. Confess, and I'd be out in 10 years. Refuse, and they'd make an example of me." His voice hardened. "I refused." The judge nodded slowly. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "this court is ordering an immediate suspension of sentencing enforcement pending full review." The gallery erupted. The gavel struck once. "But understand this," Holloway continued. "If what you're showing us is true, then this is no longer just your case." Daniel met his gaze. "I know," he said. "That's why I waited 20 years." The judge leaned forward. "Because some truths," Daniel added quietly, "only survive if you're willing to suffer long enough to prove them." The court remained silent long after the screen went dark, and no one present understood. Yet that they weren't witnessing the reopening of a case. They were witnessing the collapse of a system built on buried footage and forgotten men. The judge ordered the courtroom cleared within minutes. Reporters were ushered out, whispers echoing down the marble halls. Phones were already buzzing. A case buried for 2 decades had just clawed its way back into the light. Daniel Mercer remained standing where he was, unsure whether to sit, unsure whether to breathe. Freedom, even the possibility of it, felt unreal. For 20 years, every hope he had ever allowed himself ended in disappointment. He had learned to survive by expecting nothing. Judge Holloway returned to his chambers with the evidence files spread across his desk like pieces of a crime scene that had never been properly examined. He removed his robe and stared at the footage. Again, alone this time. The timestamp, the faces, the violence, the lies. He reached for the phone and stopped himself. This wasn't a call to the press. This wasn't a matter for political caution. This was a matter of the court correcting itself. He called internal affairs. Within hours, 2 senior investigators arrived, their expressions guarded. They had seen cases reopened before. But not like this. Not with footage. Not with timestamps. Not with a living man who had waited 20 years to speak again. Back in the holding room, Daniel sat alone. A bailiff brought him water. Another avoided eye contact. For the first time in 2 decades, no one called him inmate. No one shouted his number. He stared at the floor, remembering the night his life split in two, the sirens, the cold pavement, the interrogation room that smelled like metal and fear, the officer's voice telling him no one would believe a delivery driver over a decorated detective. He had believed them back then. Judge Holloway entered quietly. Daniel stood immediately. "Sit," the judge said. "You don't owe anyone formality." Today, Daniel obeyed. "I want you to understand something," Holloway said, sitting across from him. "What you showed today doesn't just challenge your conviction. It challenges every case that investigator ever touched." Daniel nodded. "I know. You'll face resistance," the judge continued. "From prosecutors, from police unions, from people whose careers depend on this staying buried." Daniel's voice was calm. "They already took my youth. They can't take anything else." Holloway studied him carefully. "Why didn't you break?" Daniel looked up for the first time. "Because if I confessed to something I didn't do, then the system would have won twice." Silence filled the room. That evening, a motion was filed to formally reopen Daniel Mercer's case. By morning, it was national news. The detective seen in the footage, once praised, once trusted, was placed on administrative leave. He denied everything. Called the video manipulated. Claimed the timestamp was fabricated. But timestamps don't lie, neither do backup systems. Designed to run when everything else fails. As the investigation widened, more footage surfaced. Not just of Daniel. Other nights, other rooms, other men and women who had never come home the same. The courthouse became a place of reckoning. Judge Holloway presided over every hearing himself. He refused to recuse. "If this court made the mistake," he said, "this court will correct it." Daniel sat through it all. Listening, watching, learning how close he had come to being erased forever. One afternoon, as proceedings paused, the judge called Daniel forward again. "There's something you should know," Holloway said quietly. "The prosecutor has offered a deal, time served, immediate release, no admission of wrongdoing by the department." Daniel didn't answer right away. 20 years ago, he said finally, "they offered me 10 if I confessed." The judge nodded. "I didn't wait this long just to walk out quietly," Daniel continued. "I want the truth on record." Holloway looked at him with something close to admiration. "That path will be harder," the judge said. Daniel met his eyes. So was prison. The next hearing was unlike anything the court had seen. The detective took the stand. Under oath. With the footage playing behind him, he denied. He deflected. He blamed procedure. Until Judge Holloway leaned forward and asked one question. "Why does the backup system record your badge number entering the interrogation room after it was officially logged as closed?" The detective froze. The courtroom held its breath. He had no answer. That moment, the pause, the silence, the unraveling, was when the truth finally outweighed power. By the end of the week, Daniel Mercer's conviction was officially vacated. But the judge wasn't finished. "This court finds," Holloway said, voice firm, "that justice delayed does not become justice denied if the truth is eventually allowed to speak." He struck the gavel once. Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't waiting anymore. He was free, but freedom came with a weight. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Microphones reached toward him. "What will you do now?" someone asked. Daniel paused. "I'm going to live," he said simply. "And I'm going to make sure this never happens to someone else." He walked away without another word. Behind him, Judge Holloway stood at the courthouse steps, watching. A man reclaim a life that should never have been taken. And somewhere deep in the courthouse basement, an old system continued to run quietly. Waiting. Recording. Remembering. Daniel Mercer did not sleep that night. Freedom, he learned, was louder than prison. In prison, every sound had meaning: keys, footsteps, doors. Outside, the world was chaotic. Sirens in the distance. Cars passing. Voices that didn't belong to guards. He sat at the edge of a borrowed bed in a small apartment provided by a legal aid organization, staring at his hands. They looked the same. Older, scarred, but free. 20 years earlier, those hands had been cuffed before he understood what was happening. Now they trembled under the weight of choice. By morning, the city had changed its tone. What began as a single reopened case turned into a systemic reckoning. Defense attorneys filed emergency motions. Families demanded answers. Names long protected by reputation and authority were spoken out loud for the first time. Without fear, Judge Holloway returned to the bench, knowing the storm would not spare him. "You should step aside," a senior official advised him privately. "Let another judge handle the fallout." Holloway shook his head. "If I step aside now, then the message is that justice retreats when it becomes inconvenient." The next hearing was standing room only, not because Daniel Mercer was present, but because the system itself was on trial. Witness after witness testified. Former officers, clerks, technicians, some reluctant, some relieved, all carrying pieces of a truth that had been fragmented on purpose. The detective returned to court in a different posture. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the certainty. His answers shortened. His voice lost its edge. When the judge asked him directly whether he had altered evidence in Daniel Mercer's case, the man hesitated. That hesitation was louder than any confession. "I followed orders," he finally said. The courtroom inhaled as one. Judge Holloway's voice was calm. "Orders do not override law, and obedience does not absolve guilt." The ruling that followed did not make headlines the way Daniel's release had, but it mattered more. The court formally acknowledged institutional failure. Cases were flagged. Sentences suspended. An independent review board was formed. Careers ended quietly. Others ended publicly. Justice did not roar. It corrected itself. Days later, Daniel returned to the courthouse, not as a defendant, but as a witness. He stood where he had once been broken and spoke clearly. "I don't want vengeance," he said. "I want accountability. And I want no one else to wait 20 years to be heard." The judge listened. So did the room. When Daniel finished, Judge Holloway stood. "This court thanks you," he said, "not for your patience, but for your courage." Daniel nodded once and stepped away. Outside, the city felt different. Not kinder, not softer, but more honest. Weeks later, Daniel visited the storage facility where the backup system still hummed quietly. A technician showed him the rack, obsolete, dusty, nearly forgotten. "This thing saved your life," the technician said. Daniel smiled faintly. "It just did its job." Before leaving, Daniel placed a small label on the rack, not his name, not the case number. Just the day the truth was recorded. On his way out, he passed a young man sitting nervously in the hallway, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. Daniel stopped. "First time?" he asked. The man nodded. Daniel sat beside him. "Whatever happens in there, don't stop telling the truth, even if it takes a long time." The young man looked up, surprised. "They'll listen?" Daniel stood. "Eventually." He walked away without waiting for thanks. Back in his chambers, Judge Holloway closed a file and turned off the light. He paused, looking at the bench one last time. Justice, he realized, wasn't about speed. It was about memory. And sometimes, All it took to restore it was a man who remembered and refused to let the system forget. The courthouse door is closed. Behind him, but somewhere, deep beneath the building, the backup system continued to run. Quiet, patient, waiting for the truth whenever it was needed again.